William Lane Craig gives his defense of God and the slaughter of the Canaanites, and it was amazing. Let's check it out. If you recall, Richard Dawkins said that he would not debate William Lane Craig because he had such a contempt for him because William Lane Craig defended that the slaughter of the Canaanites. He defended the conquest, essentially. And he said that was so immoral to defend the conquest that he would not debate him. So now William Lane Craig, on the same podcast Richard Dawkins was on, Alex O'Connor's podcast, gives the defense.
The slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites.
All right. Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land of Canaan, or modern-day Israel, was populated by small clans of Canaanite inhabitants. And according to the biblical narrative, these clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally and opposed God. And God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then he called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death. And I am giving this land to you, to Israel. So they were the pre-Israeli inhabitants of this region of the world on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
This wasn't just like some random group of really good people, super moral people that God just randomly says, well, too bad you were in the wrong place at the wrong time and now we're going to destroy you. No, these were very, very evil people, did a lot of evil things. And the fact that they were not completely rooted out was actually an opportunity for them to continue to manifest that evil. And they even drew away God's people.
And on the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho, it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. If there was an innocent person among the adults, that person didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They were be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel, people will talk about coming to the land. That's how they refer to it. So what God was doing was giving the land of Canaan to Israel and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of Canaan.
Basically, right now, William Lane Craig is saying it wasn't like a simple God says you need to kill everyone. It was you need to drive them out of the land. And so for some people, they died in that process, not like incidentally they died. They fought for the land that they were living in. Again, they were living in Canaan. They were evil, wicked nations. Judgment is coming upon them on behalf of a holy and righteous God. And so there were wars, there were battles that were fought. So people either died in war or they were driven out of the land. That's exactly what happened. So it's a little bit more context, but then he goes a little bit further with this.
So they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them, and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
Right.
So Alex is basically saying, if you didn't notice there, he's saying, I know the way you're framing it is there was this evil nation judgments coming upon them. But for me, what it looks like to me is these poor people are living in their land and now they're forced to get out. Otherwise, they're going to be killed. That's the way. So these are the two perspectives.
Talking about whether or not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of.
Okay, so now William Lane Craig, and this is an important point here. Alex just made a point saying, like, I get that's where you're coming from, but here's where I'm coming from. This is not a palatable situation to me. This is something that makes our alarm bells go off in my head, and this is what he's going to say at some point later. This doesn't feel right to me, and he's going to make this point a little bit later. Maybe I can't prove that God is immoral, that this is wrong, he says, but it just doesn't feel right. So now what William Lane Craig is going to do is give the moral argument for this, the moral underpinning of this, so that if it doesn't feel right, you can still know that it is right.
This action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself.
Okay, so the dumbed down Marco version of this, the version that if you ask me to explain this in my own brain level, knowledge level, here's basically what he's saying here. When you are morally obligated to do something, where does the moral obligation come from? It comes from a moral authority, and God in this case, who is not someone who accesses morality. God is the outpouring of what morality is. Again, Euthyphro's dilemma tries to come against God in this way, but it's dealt with in this exact argument as well. People say, does God say what's good and evil because he has figured out what is good and evil, or did God just randomly decide what is good and evil? The reality is neither. God by his very nature is good, and so therefore evil is identified because God is good. So he is the moral authority. So when you are morally obligated to do something, it comes from a moral command given by the moral authority, who is God, who is himself morality and goodness, the outpouring of that morality. That's what William Lane Craig is saying here. So it might seem not palatable to you. It might seem a little, uncomfortable to you, or even immoral to you. But what he's saying is, where do moral obligations come from? They come from a God who not only is the authority, but is himself the source of goodness and morality. He knows best, and he is in the place of being able to decide what is going to happen.
So what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he will. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative.
So the reason why you can't kill me morally, but God can kill me morally, is because God is the moral authority and the moral outpouring, or the outpouring of morality and goodness. If God were to kill me, there is a good moral reason for that. Now, a lot of atheists have gotten upset about this argument here, and the reason why is because the logic of it is very sound, and a lot of them are just saying, so basically what you're saying is God said so. Maybe if you want to dumb down the argument, you can say God said so, but it's not so simple. It is not only did God say so, but God said so as the moral, as the moral authority and the moral source. The outpouring of morality, goodness and morality come from God. So it isn't just he said so, it is the source of morality, and the authoritative morality source has said so. That's exactly what the argument is here. And it is an extremely difficult, if not impossible, argument to objectively refute. And that's why a lot of people are upset. You read the comments of this video, that's basically what they're saying about William Lane Craig and the argument that he gave here.
So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature.
If God had a moral obligation to fulfill, that means that there is a standard above him. Again, back to Euthyphro's dilemma. But God does not have a standard above him. God is himself the standard. That's what William Lane Craig is saying here. So some go, oh, God gets to play by different rules or something like that. You can put it that way in a sense because, again, God, it's not that he's playing by different rules. God doesn't have rules. God is the outpouring. God is the source of the good moral rules. You and I have to play by his rules. He is the authority. We are not. He is the source of goodness and objective goodness himself, and we are not.
And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of internal inconsistency between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second, in this case, would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other because God wrongs no one in issuing such a command. And if he wrongs no one, then there is no moral constraint on his issuing such a command.
Now, this is where the argument gets more unpalatable again for someone like Alex O'Connor or just anyone, a lot of people in general. It's a difficult thing to wrestle with. The logic is sound, but it's a difficult thing to wrestle with emotionally and just internally as people with flawed thinking, imperfect humans. Because when he says God wrongs no one, what is he meaning here? God does not wrong the Canaanites who died in these wars. They were immoral people, and judgment was being passed upon them by a holy God, the source of justice himself. He doesn't wrong them by punishing them and giving them the opportunity to leave. He doesn't wrong them by casting them out of their own land. Why? Because this is judgment upon them. This is a punishment. If you were to commit a crime and the police come take you from your house and they cast you out of your house, have they wronged you? No. They're giving you just punishment for your crime. And he even makes the argument that when it comes to, let's say, the innocent children and the animals, has God wronged them? Well, no. Because ultimately, if these children die, it is not because of something that they did, and it's not really because of something that God did. They died because of what their parents did. Children suffer the consequences of the wrong actions of their parents all the time. And these warnings are given to people all throughout the Bible. And God does not wrong these children by ending their lives early as a result of these wars. And then as a result of these casting out of the lands, God doesn't end their life by bringing them to him sooner. In fact, with them not growing up and ending up like their parents, you can even argue that it's better for them in that situation, that God doesn't wrong them either. Now, again, that's the part of the argument that's less palatable to people, but the logic is still sound. Your only argument here is that it just doesn't feel right to you. That's a subjective argument, but the logic of this is very, very sound. Let me know what you think, though. Maybe I'll get some flack for that. It's a very interesting video. Highly recommend that you watch it. Alex O'Connor's YouTube channel here. Very, very good stuff all around. William Lane Craig, I think, did an amazing, masterful job at laying out this counter argument to what Richard Dawkins was saying. God bless you. Let me know what you think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Consider supporting on Patreon. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.